from Toronto. I'm really glad to join the Experio Lab community for a discussion on the problematizing, the opening up of a question that's important to me. And I hope that through the seminar and the discussion, it will become intriguing for you and will start to open up some new possibilities. The real question at the source of this discussion for me is, what is system value and how do we create it as designers? So when I was asked to speak at Experio, I originally felt that a sophisticated concept would be quite cool. So the title of systemic design for complex services, multiple goals, logics, and rhythms. So as I started really developing the conceptual framework, the ideas that went into supporting the argument and the discussion for today, I found that the rhythms, essentially the temporal logic in system value, would require its own discussion. It was really too much. So I've dropped rhythms. I only touch on it as it would open up to really develop it. Areas like the anticipatory systems, the logics of futuring, temporal cycles, historical cycles and their relationship to futures, reperceiving time. I mean, there's some great concepts on the side of rhythms or temporality, but I'm going to focus more on this kind of idea of system value and the development of what an offer would actually be within complex systems, complex services that become systems. The main thrust of the talk then and the argument is to explore this concept of system value, which I think is vaguely defined when it is defined. It's very nascent. It's a fairly new idea. I'd like to, it is when Crystal Van Ale and I were first developing the system value proposition tool for the design journeys book. It was, there wasn't a lot to base it on. We didn't want to base it on a derivation of, the Osterwalder and Pinure value proposition canvas or something like that. We do have a canvas, and I'll touch on that. But the purpose for this seminar, the discussion, is to, I'll get into slides in a minute, but I just wanted to share what this is about first and why this is important to me. I'd like to start seeking agreement for a theoretical basis for what a system value proposition is and how that could become encoded in offers to the system participants within a complex service system or in a complex field like a municipality. And we're doing work with a lot of cities these days, and the system value that's provided from a leadership group within a city, within a municipality that might be providing long-term value for people beyond the political life cycle, for example. And so so what is the basis of that system value? We define value for service improvement at the micro level, say touch points for a patient experience. The whole system is not changed that much. Even if we design that micro service or micro system, that may be a complete service very well. So one good implementation does not automatically become a system change. It gets absorbed into the system. So we ought to find ways to create reciprocal value frames where the service provision, it can create an offer that has impact for idealization over time, and it can create over time yield an ideal system. And this touches on ideas that Ryan Murphy and I have developed in the systemic theory of change work, which I'll mention now, but I don't really touch on that much even in this talk. I think of this idea of the unfolding of system value. There is emergence, there is co-creation, but it's like a system change movement within an actor network. And I think service design has certainly benefited overall from the development of corollary of the service dominant logic concept that actually preceded the service design field. I mean, there was a lot of work in service systems and system management that actually preceded service design, and in the SDL concepts, early papers from about 2007 were at least 5 years before serious service design practices and well before the literature in the field that followed. And since then, the service design logic has expanded into service ecosystems concepts, and that has actually been led well by systemic design theories such as Josina Vink and all 2017 and other work since then. The service ecosystem concept is, I think, very well developed now. But service design itself has become more complex since then and recently. It has moved into complex services that are essentially systems. So, but nothing similar has been developed in systemic design that facilitates a level of value that can produce through an offer to the clients of a system, that is the sponsors that are supporting the development of a service system or a larger scale systems of impact. So I think this is for many reasons, since much of systemic design has been developed from advanced design programs in universities, and practices have grown from some of these well-developed schools of thought. But many of our students say from, from OCAD University and our program, Strategic Foresight and Innovation, they will graduate and work in service design, and our own systemic design projects are positioned differently than service design. But design itself has its own value offers. That is how, there's value that's created by what we design, but design itself creates the offer of the learning and the design participation. And that's separate from the value that's also generated by the systems themselves. So the questions here is how we can design value within systems, and I think that has not been answered. I'm not going to answer it today, but really open it up. In other words, I think it's the start of a conversation here among us. And so one of the key ideas will be the idea of a system logic to locate and explore the creation of value that could be similar to service dominant logic. I'm not going, it's not really system dominant logic, and there are reasons for that. There are many types of systems and multiple systems theories and many logics that might apply. So the growth of systemic design has expanded, or service design rather, is expanded into complex multi-stakeholder, multi-service complex systems. And so there's blending in these fields now in terms of practice. But in the system side, there are multiple logics to choose from, and what makes the most sense to create value. The logic of design as well is not like when we talk about this type of logic. It's not truth value logic, like in epistemology, but a logic of use value. How value is the logic for how value is understood and takes shape over long term. So I'm interested here in co-creating and how we co-create system value, not just as value to beneficiaries, as in service dominant logic, but relative to the future value of a system change program, for example. And so I'll also reintroduce myself. Some that may not know me, but I think there are a number of friends in the room and colleagues. But I'm Peter Jones, professor at OCAD University, where one of the professors from the start of the university era at OCAD and developing the master's programs, including a master's of design and health and strategic foresight and innovation. I've included a couple of other logos here because it's right to say that, in the introduction, that I'm moving into a position of a distinguished professor of systemic design at Tecnológico de Monterrey in I'll be in Mexico City starting in January. So I'll still be at OCAD and then teaching a little bit and keeping the community, keeping in touch with the community, but I'm essentially moving to Tech de Monterrey starting in 2024. And with this kind of connects multiple other communities working in with the Relating Systems Thinking and Design, or the RSD Symposium, Systemic Design Association, which has grown up around that, and the other kinds of communities of practice, some of which are indicated here, which continue to flourish as networks and are in some ways test beds for the ideas and research that I'm working from, and the source of some of the ideas today as well, of course. So I promise the logos will drop off after this slide. So I did want to also open with something of a very brief manifesto too. So this is actually the opening for the core part of the talk. Systems thinking is not the solution. It's only the start of the understanding of complexity. Looking for solutions only anchors our fixation on a perceived problem, as we get fixated into problem solution form of thinking. And what's different than, and why design is different than systems thinking. Design is a process to create connections that shape the future. And so that, so this is about this relationship of design application to systems and systems thinking, of course. So in terms of design for complex services, the purpose is to explore the boundary of service and systemic design, comparing the logics, rules of design that can determine what is valued. How is value created in complex systems or in services that form as systems over time? We often, with clients, artificially separate the domains of design value based on custom. That is, that design fields have grown up with industries over time. We have certain genres of description of design. I mean, we may call it industrial design, but to our clients, there are certain, we're doing digital design work, user experience work, service design, and client contexts don't yet have a really good place to hold systemic design. I'm not sure it's important that they do in terms of the name, but there is a tremendous amount of value, I think, that is available in this area, and we don't have a good description of how that value is created and provided in terms of the understanding from clients. One of the questions is, as skilled designers, what can we guarantee to deliver in this field? And are we speaking in different languages? So service design created a practice of designing reliable experiences across space and time that is reliable, repeatable to some extent, well understood in terms of the methodology. Service design extends into value chains and can affect end-to-end experiences for a mixes of users and complex value chains, value constellations. And so complex services are a type of system problem. The logic of service, though, does not scale or resolve conflicts between different service contexts. That, to me, is a system problem. And that's where we start to get to a blend between where services and service design for those not end, but start to really become more of a complex system task and require different methodologies. So so in terms of complex systems, then services then create these processes that realize an organization's value offer to customers, right? So that's just why we're doing service design work. And in the different fields, that is, we're improving or creating net new value as the offer that our clients provide to their customers. But they are also, services are also complex abstractions of preferential value interactions. That is, we create abstract models, journeys, and blueprints that are understood as representation of a future delivery of our value as design. And this can be this value can be optimized at the point of the service, maximized for the outcome of a service to a recipient, and in terms of service dominant logic. And it can be optimized within a system logic as the total value of the system according to the system purpose. When we often talk about systems being broken, like the healthcare, like in the US, the fragmented healthcare, private, and to some extent public healthcare system mixes, or even in Canada with multiple health services at different levels of care and different pairs and policies even within public care. When we talk about fragmented, with a system being fragmented or even broken, we're saying that the value is not coherent and that there are breakdowns in the value according to the system purpose. So we have, I think, value dilemmas then between these different levels of the provision of value and the ways of discussing them. So, and this gets into how we frame projects and how projects start and whether a service project can be framed as expanding the boundaries into a complex system from the very start. So that when these dilemmas coming out of healthcare, maybe the healthcare system reveals tensions between individual health outcomes that can be maximized within a service journey versus the system logic, which might be to maximize health overall at a level of the shared value to a population, including cost benefit trade-offs and the experience of that value in the long-term provision. And so I'll just share one of a couple of different healthcare cases. This one's actually a simple case, but it's a complex area. Social prescribing illustrates this value dilemma, I think. It's a new practice of primary care and preventive care, identifying problematic situations in a patient's lifestyle, living conditions, and in the quality of life and social determinants of health that are within within their living conditions and their lifestyle. And the social prescription might be actually a prescription to live in a different housing situation and to change lifestyle habits and to perhaps get coaching and other types of personal supports and change of life conditions. And that would be prescribed as medication might be. And they're developing that here in Ontario, the communities of practice. But at each domain, if we look at this by now familiar model that I like to use because it works for practices, design domains from levels design from 1 through 4. And so at each domain of design value, the offer differs and the options within that in providing value differ. So design 1, we can design to inform about social prescribing and share the value about that offer and the opportunity to providers. In other words, perhaps websites about social prescribing to help inform healthcare providers about what it is and how to do it. In Design 2.0, product service design and the field of understanding the market and providing services or products within a known market that you can do research within that market and do reliable provision of service. So we can design for the delivery of social prescription as a service to patients. And so collaboration with physicians and with, perhaps we aren't doing this, but I think it would be appropriate in different area in different healthcare systems to work with the College of Family and primary care physicians, to colleges, to design good social prescribing services. Design 3.0, though, would actually be working with those organizations, hospitals and other health provision organizations for the provision of this offer, because it changes the value offers of the organization itself and what it presents itself as, and how it understands its own workflow. And it may change workflow dramatically. And so, just develop the service and throw it out there and work directly, provider patient. It changes the organization. But design 4.0 is, well, then should we just be, why don't we change the housing and food systems and try to eliminate food deserts? And, that is in the complex system that aggravates the social determinants of health. Can we consider a logic of enhancing the health systems and the communities themselves to reduce the negative impact of these social determinants of health? That is actually designing within the system. And so we'll just show a synthesis map developed by a brilliant student team of ours in the Design for Health program, and Clayton Windat and Yoshi Pereira and a couple of others that developed and Yoshi Pereira has continued to work with this synthesis map to actually develop the game that you see here. So this is the game board for social prescribing, was developed as a map or a model of the models of complex system relationships. So you can see an intervention wheel in the upper right, and it looks like the spinner in the game, and that is out of the design journey's intervention strategy. And so the different levels of intervention, according to Donnell Meadows, 12 points to intervene are there. There are causal loops on the cards that you would flip. There are persona cards that you play, and chutes and ladders in the board or like that. And Yoshi has gone on to develop not this actual game board, even though there is that, but an actual card game that's used for teaching social prescription. And so sometimes these research projects that are done for the conclusion of a program for the degree requirements continue, in their life and work. This is one of those cases. So the color is switched. Now I'm going to talk about service logic a little bit, but are there any questions up to this point? So I see things in the chat, but I don't actually see the questions. I just see the bubble. So, okay. So if there are questions that you want to put into the chat, I can pick them up at different points, or the colleague could, can break in a way at knowing some of the points or the pacing of things. Okay. So let me talk about service dominant logic. This may be very familiar to those that are experienced service designers, but just to kind of level set what this is, because it'll be building from that on kind of theory of a system offer. And service dominant logic, developed by Steve Vargo, Lush, Mahlio, Sporer, and others over the years, but going back almost really 20 years, defines how services function in an economic exchange. And so services are conceived in service dominant logic as the co-creation of value. And we think of it, I think, primarily as the experience of the value, how value is understood to a beneficiary. And it is not service delivery as such. And that's one of the key ideas in SDL, is that it's not a service provider delivering, the functionality from a business promise, to a market. I mean, that is actually goods dominant logic. That is, the product is what it is. You can compare it with other similar products. There might be some services associated with it, but you buy the product and it's yours. But the service is the fulfillment of value, and it is co-created between the provider and the beneficiary. The value co-creation results from that realization of value. And this is simply just acknowledging that that step, or that we call a touch point, or the value proposition has been realized. So the different steps along the way, and at the end, we've completed, successful flight and, to another city. We're in the hotel. We don't even, a satisfying flight is a good thing, and the value has been realized, and we're okay with that. Breakdowns in service lead to frustration, and so, service value is very often just the completion of the promise rather than some extraordinary experience, although there's a range of fulfillments and a range of experiences that can be provided, of course, or realized. So value is made so by that recipient, by us, by the beneficiaries in this encounter, and in contrast with the goods dominant logic, because where goods are reproducible as the same object, they can be owned, they're rivalrous. If I have one, you can't have the same thing. They're finite when they run out. They're limited, but not that services are infinite, but that they're continuous. That is, they can theoretically scale to multiple providers for a same service if the demand is there. And so some of the axioms, there's a small set of axioms that define service dominant logic, and this cycle of value co-creation. That is, so the cycle itself shows that we have, from the top, we have, if we have a service ecosystem already, there are actors within that are involved in the integration of resources that have a service exchange that can also be developed through institutions and their arrangements within the service ecosystem. This is an abstraction of the value co-creation in that whole ecosystem. This is what makes service dominant logic more like system value. But the actual axioms, kind of 1 through 5, as they're defined in literature, is that, service is a fundamental basis of exchange. The value is co-created by multiple actors, always benefiting or including the beneficiary. So it's recognized by the beneficiary that all economic actors and in society, social actors relative to what's called a service are resource integrators. That is, they draw on knowledge and on other services, perhaps, that it isn't just limited to, a rote exchange. There's some problem solving. There is, knowledge brought in. So we call that resource integration. And value is always determined then by when the beneficiary is complete with that, and value. And then this idea of value co-creation coordinated through actor-generated institutions has led to the service ecosystem. Right? And if we look at any given journey map, we can identify how service dominant logic appears within the flow of a particular actor. This is out of Design for Care, and I use this a lot because it's complex but yet simple, and I understand it well enough to touch on a lot of different parts of it rather than using one that, that is, you can see it all at a glance. So it's fairly complete. So this is the journey over time at fairly large scale touch points of Elena, a persona who's an individual who starts as a caregiver to her father, all the way to the left. So the starting point, her role in the persona in the service ecosystem is as somebody who's actually providing care within a family care provision context. And then she has an incident which is difficult to diagnose, and it turns out to be a complex arrhythmia that requires specialist care. Primary care can't in this second stage. Primary care can't identify exactly what it is. So the caregiving itself. So in the initial context, as to say, in the conditions in which this persona is in her own life as life happens. So phenomenologically, her conditions and her absorbed and her role is as would be self-acknowledged as a care provider, and is co-created, and that is with her father and other family and friends. And so it fulfills the needs of her father, but also in her own experience. So there is this. So this is actually relative to service logic. So the father is real. Oh, I might be breaking up a little bit. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, it sounds good.
Zoom messages of instability. All right, good. So we can look at, does informal caregiving meet the different axioms of service dominant logic? And it probably does. Is it a service? Can we actually design for informal caregiving? I have a recent graduate, also within, I mentioned Yoshi Pereira, so another recent graduate, also developed a service system process for informal caregiving. And this isn't really public yet, but I think it's really, early work also there. I think this is an area that really comes into kind of a complex human system that really fits service dominant logic. But the ecosystem is kind of informal. It's within a micro, really the micro system, as we would call it, within a social system that's very tightly defined within that caregiver's world. But then when this particular persona becomes a patient, and so that's why the color of the persona of the same person, her role changes as she becomes a different type of patient in each one of these touch points. So I'll just mention the primary care just as a reference. I won't talk about the specialty care or the outcomes here, but the primary care, is that co-created? Do we think of like if we have really an excellent family doctor, perhaps there is really a conversational and co-creative relationship that goes outside customary medications and lab tests and the exam, and customary diagnosis and then following the kind of the notional healthcare system as we understand it. But primary care could be co-created and probably much more effectively. Can we consider doctors as resource integrators? I think they would see themselves as that. And they're certainly within complex institutions, even if they have private offices, those offices are within institutional arrangements that are payers, providers within insurance or within public health care or public health support or systems. And then is health as we receive it, then is the value of the health that follows successful diagnosis and treatment plan, is that a service? And can we design it? Do we co-create our health? I think we certainly do. I call this a health-seeking process, right? So it's health-seeking within a healthcare system. Active patients are seeking to restore their own health to what's normal, not like maximize health, but it's a restorative process to what feels as normal. For some of us, normal is very optimized, and others, normal is kind of getting by, but it's still, we live within, this range of normals. And then, is the actual care as care? That is, we look at then how do we know we're being cared for? Like a neonatal or their father is a very different feeling of care than the primary care physician for them usually. And so can actual care is it implicit in the system? Do we understand it? And is that a system logic that is, the promise of health as an outcome as opposed to health as a service? And so this is where I'm going with then what service, between service and system value. That system value is delivering on the promise of things like the value of health, which shouldn't be an abstraction. It should be, some substantive primary value in our lives that is well understood and we can define, and not necessarily just as, you know, the provision of particular service, as, you know, in service dominant logic, even if it's a good service. So I'm going to say a little bit more about how service value systems now evolve into the value proposition or the offer. So I like Richard Norman and Rafael Ramirez's theory of the offering, started in 1989, but also work from in the 1990s on this, on developing, which is really a system theory in a sense of how value is understood within the offer, but they define it in a way that business people can understand it. This was developed for early system management. I think this led to service dominant logic, although they didn't call it that in their books. More developing of the offering in services as artifacts designed to more effectively enable and organize value co-production. It's really identical to SDL in some ways. So, but the key feature of Norman, and you need to really, you know, fortunately, I think Richard Norman died before his time. He was fairly young as he goes. He was Swedish, and was, I think, you know, way ahead of this field in this time. And their notion of the value constellation, which was really a radical and a breakthrough idea. It was not the value chain, but it was this co-creation of complex value within, you know, multiple systems for innovating at the level of service, like the IKEA, you know. So they use, you know, a lot of work with IKEA and the notion of like the value of the furniture that is flat packed and then co-created at home. That this is the creation of a value constellation that is similar to a service ecosystem. It's what Chibora calls, or who also is no longer with us, but his work on the formative context is kind of an installed base of infrastructures that we can work with and use the infrastructure, but also improve those systems of those formative infrastructures that are already always available to us, that change more slowly, but that they can actively reconfigure what is value as a creative ideation process. So there's a lot of design in their book on reframing business, or Norman's book. So the service ecosystem extends service dominant logic into these multiple facilitative relationships, institutional agreements, multiple service providers, and like in healthcare, we have a lot of infrastructure. And then also this idea of products can be servitized. And Norman thought really that the distinction between goods and services was one of a continuum, and that because goods can be servitized, an awkward word that he coined that helps us think about that process. But then from system logic, we might think in terms from systems theory of socio-technical systems. And we don't think of value within socio-technical systems. We think of kind of almost the engineering optimization of complex work systems and organizations, or the back end of healthcare. We're integrating multiple services and infrastructure functions, and these become complex as they evolve. They may not be complex at first, and they become complex adaptive systems because they adapt over time and become complex because they become integrated. And then the original kind of step-by-step complicated systems of socio-technical systems, they lose their kind of service identity and become kind of complex functioning infrastructures. And that new service provision comes in and uses. That's why they're difficult to change. The complexity emerges as functional relationships between all the moving parts in a socio-technical system. And it makes it much more difficult to change because there are thousands of dependencies on things like data and and the interaction relationships and work roles and the provision of steps of things, especially like in healthcare. So services can be designed as a whole system, that is, as an intervention proposal that can enhance the system value. So services, in other words, are parts of a complex system that can change the system. And so you can look at this as a trade space. That is, there are within the total system, say the healthcare system, there can be more or less future value that is created by improving services or redesigning services. And we don't have good ways to measure the outcomes of that value. It's kind of fuzzy how the future emergent value will actually take shape. We're trying to develop tools for this, but it can take a long time to even develop the evaluations from a prototype or from the concept that can help us make these trade-offs to determine, what level of development a service proposal might take. And this becomes a system problem. And so this is why I think we need to understand system logics and what counts as value, how we measure that value. So then design logic, that is, as designers, we use a different logic. We use things like staged recursion. In other words, iterations over time box cycles of the design process. This is an abductive process. We know that we're really done with the framing of a complex project when we have agreement on its parameters. We have agreement on, from the client. We've done some research to justify that, and we feel that we believe we can do prototypes, or maybe after the prototype, it's another cycle of recursion that reflects back on itself and informs that stage. And then so that we are co-creating the value through a learning process within a period of time that we're conducting, design. So the design logic is a type of, it is a type of system logic in and of itself. It's a learning, co-creative learning process and in service design, we are developing essentially a minimum viable service, which itself is a type of system. Because it has boundaries, it has an intervention, a theory of intervention, it has formulated ways of using other resources to develop value, right? So, but we don't necessarily think of it that way. So we use a design logic in the creation of these services. So design goals then, that is the goals of what constitutes a successful design project for ourselves, they're guided by a logic that enables these satisfactory interim outcomes, right? So each design stage from, framing and user research and early design through prototyping, iterative cycles. So whatever our model of design is, it's guided by a logic that the interim outcomes are satisfying, and a learning and then create agreement, and it's short of the idealized final processes itself. So often we, like service design especially, may not be there to actually implement it, or not very much. That is, we work with the client on the development, on their development of the service proposal, which they then work through the implementation of. So the idealized, that is the perfect final process, is something that we develop, that they develop. So it's co-created value, but it has and it may have different endpoints. And so design, this kind of foresighted design, like where the outcome of the design process is going, constructs arguments to avoid imbalanced compromises that I would call, that is in the early stage. That is, we're trying to avoid failure as well as develop as idealized a process as possible. So we're trying to look for, part of optimization in a complex or socio-technical system is to avoid imbalanced compromises where we're perhaps agreeing with a client constraint that we can see is going to create problems in their implementation down the road. And so this is, part of that trading area. And so this is an image from Crystal and I from a Touchpoint article on Systemic Design Toolkit that describes how we see the relationship of systemic design as this more field of understanding different logics, that logic of system change, of intervention design, organizational, interorganizational relationship design, system value creation. And those are potentials, but what we often are designing really in a more concrete way for is, interaction design within service design as a type of service experience, or user. Often this is considered even a user experience, follows a user experience methodology. And user experience methodology is optimizing interactions as touch points across the stages of service, but recognizing that there are resources and systems that are available within, and a systemic design approach helps keep this larger scale of providing that value more fluid. But I'd say from a systems perspective, not all the value that is available in the system is co-created in the way that service dominant logic would be. So service dominant logic, or what happens in service design, is co-created. So it's relative to the beneficiary's declaration that value has been received. But then the system itself may have significant other value, and value that isn't even intended for the direct beneficiaries, future value, and it can also have negative or negative value, that is, like corruption, could be value that is not understood, that is not to the beneficiary, but becomes extracted through feedback that is undetected within a complex system, and that can be done in through industry relationships and things like that. So these things evolve, and we don't have a good language for them. So I think we need something like a system dominant logic that can, but I wouldn't call it that, for one thing. There's already an SDL, but it would assume, it would make, there's not going to be a small set of axioms. There are a lot of system logics. So service logic does integrate these system functions if developing like this minimum viable service system, but the value co-creation, has its own cycle. It's an emergent phenomenon. There's the value co-creation within a system may come from a service within that system. So this is an example from Spotify on the right, from Lüftenegger from 10 years ago, of the service dominant ecosystem of Spotify. And so this shows, again, these multiple levels of value and within service provision. But we could think of something like the offer in the Spotify ecosystem as an attractor basin. That is, in a complex system, is an attractor basin within an economic ecosystem. That is, within a market, becomes a stronger and stronger attractor. And this is how it becomes kind of monopolistic. It draws more resources into itself as it becomes larger. It creates the success to the successful type of system archetype, and it follows the rules of complex system logic then. And so it can become like a macro attractor. And service ecosystems then subsume these constructs of system constructs, socio-ecological system, socio-technical systems, and become part of the co-creation of value in a complex system. And so so I don't need to say too much more about that, but I just want to say that the Spotify as a service ecosystem is this is a high capital flow through system, and it actually destroys a lot of value. So as a service ecosystem, there's a lot of system value that is destroyed. Now it maximizes profit and the end user experience value in the direct offer to the listener or whatever. The center of this ecosystem is the promise of Spotify as an app that provides a well understood value of streaming music, and that is provided through its and other content provided through the service ecosystem. So from an end user and UX perspective, it's highly optimized. It's created major negative feedbacks within the larger music ecosystem. It destroys the value of musicians, and they've got good brand value, but they have terrible economic outcomes resulting from the influence of major players like, the Apple ecosystem and Spotify, for example. These have not been developed in a way to really, to help develop new musicians and kind of the actual purpose of music. It's kind of like optimizing the healthcare system to help, the particular diagnoses and treatments that are all good in and of themselves, but the overall system is destroying value of health. For example, people who become dependent on the healthcare system and don't co-create their own health. There's going to be a different logic in different ecosystems, right? So I'm going to have to speed up a bit, so stay with me here. So system logics, and I'm not going to talk about all these. This is actually an image from Design Journeys as well. It shows that the 30, and there are more, system models that have been developed as tools in the systemic design toolkit. And this is to really illustrate, there's no single system logic that describes all of these. We have a 7-stage design methodology in which these are allocated, and those are across that design logic, right? The design process logic. But it's a design problem itself to identify the best out of the competing theories that help us describe to a system sponsor, a system project, if you will, to help satisfy the goals and needs for a system sponsor within a complex system. So every school of systems thinking has a different core logic. None of them are actually wrong. You go back to Bertalanffy and open systems as a first systems biologist. It's not wrong today. It's been superseded by a lot of other thinking. Kenneth Boulding, Ross Ashby. These are, the theories underlying even, the first systems theories are good theories. They still are. And they kind of compete for our attention. So we have some that we use more than others in different contexts. So there's a different logic. They're all a systems logic in a sense, but you go to a systems conference and there's still a lot of argument about these things. And so even with all this scientific precedent, each model is a unique form. It has its own value to the user of that systems theory. And, so each of these now 50 tools have been developed from a systems theory. And there are some that are common. We use a lot of multi-level perspective, for example. We use intervention theory a lot, but but even if we account for these shared models like actor network theory, MLP, multi-level perspective from Gales, causal layered analysis from Inyatola, socio-ecological and socio-technical systems from Emery and Trist, causal, system dynamics, leverage theory. There are too many of these to adopt in a single design plan, right? So just touch on these without saying any more about them. This is just like 9 different systems theory logics and how they are visually described differently. And so the concept of the design journeys book was to show how these different that tools that can help us learn kind of the core value of each one of these theories and apply them in complex design can be allocated across the stages. So there's, I mentioned some of these, but also want to, you may know Stafford Beer's viable systems model for organizational value development and within an environment for becoming a viable system as an organization or a business. Conversation and language action perspective, conversation theory, living systems theory, and transformation systems, which has been developed recently in the last few years as well. We talk about organization or system transformation. And so, like in design journeys, we can talk about methodological pluralism. This is not anything goes, right? So, and this is Peter Stoico's System Viz. This is the codex that has continued to develop, which shows very grand. And so this is downloadable from systemviz.com. This is the codex as kind of synthesis map of the different specific logics for within a system of understanding complexity at the interaction level. So identifying drivers, signals, states, boundaries, relations, and domains within this map across multiple categories. So this could be fascinating to people that actually want to then look at how these different system concepts can be connected together. But let's talk about system value here then. Just finish really on this, that the idea of system value can be like an exemplar for a system model that shares service dominant logic and system, or what might be really considered a process logic. And the value propositions, right, are an offer of benefits or value that are promised to current or future customers for a product or service. And a system value proposition would not, maybe of value to current and future customers, but really not customers. We think of them as participants in the system. That is, there can be many unseen beneficiaries that don't realize or will not realize that they're part of a system that they had no constitution in, but they are participants within, like the healthcare system. So this idea of total system value has emerged from system concepts of value co-creation that can occur over multiple levels, like in this diagram, which is developed out of design journeys. So the micro through macro levels and over stages of time as well. So from user, organization, the ecosystem, and society. So we have multiple levels of value that can also then be higher or lower or defined in different domains or dimensions, such as domain of economy, of individual or social psychology, sociological or societal level, and in ecosystems. And originally, our concept was developed out of the value framework of Elke de Uden from paper innovation design. But we've continued to develop that as the concept of total system value, and that a system can guarantee, as a design, can guarantee a value offer. As a simple, we think, this is a framework that we try to make as simple as possible that can be co-created by participants in workshops to show multi-level value that enables this abductive selection of best fit value propositions, that are generated by the stakeholders themselves. So best fit value propositions are multiple possible proposals for value at those different levels. So we use a template like this that can be used in Miro boards or whiteboards and printed up. So we map this out by mapping out the different levels at each different level, from the micro, that is the individual, whether that's a user, citizens, and different personas out to meso, macro, and an ecosystem. And then we typically use those four lenses as dimensions of value, and then can translate, and then this can be used to translate that system value proposition, if you will, to goals. So this is an example from another student project from a complex value proposition for a housing system within, well, Toronto's well known as kind of a housing bubble city. And so this is something that our students are often trying to take as a complex challenge. And so you can't read it, you can get an idea of the development of the multiple constructs in the economic and environmental aspects. And then also they changed the social to psychosocial, and then and political, seeing like in housing, there are political barriers to action. And so then this development of shared understanding of value can be used to develop positioning, intervention, prototyping, and all that. And so there's a logic of system making that we use here. So all forms of system co-creation, that is of making a system, not saying that we create the whole system, but there is a system making kind of idea that we can take forward here, that the creation of the value agreement on a complex value proposition for a system, we can use system co-creation concepts as to entail future visioning. That is, we're creating a vision for the future value. And I'd refer to a core logic then of how that value is made to Hugh Dubberly's with Shelley Evenson and Rick Robinson's analysis synthesis bridge model. If you haven't seen this, and I would think many may not have because it's from 2008, so people don't talk about it as much. I said about older systems theories, they are, this is a model from what is to what could be. And it goes from, a concrete understanding of what is, goes from concrete to abstractions, and a model of what is, which we do as system models, and then the bridge through prototyping and co-creation to an abstract model of what could be, and then the implementation of what could be. And so this may be kind of like the double diamond or the single diamond from divergence and convergence is kind of a core logic model in that. But systems logics are not service dominant logic. So this will be a way to really show where it's going, that complex systems do not exist, in themselves to serve markets or customers. There are services within the complex systems that do, and we might say that some do, but that's not really they have a purpose which the whole system meets together. But except there are exceptions. But the reason I say that is that systems generally don't have owners, that is, decision makers that can change the system through finance or will. And they do not have value seekers that understand themselves to be in the system, but at components of the system, parts, services, or parts of a complex system. But systems are not entirely emergent either. They don't just emerge. Some of the frustration I have with trying to apply complex adaptive systems to everything as a CAS, it's, we co-create new social systems every time we start up a for-purpose nonprofit or an intentional network or a policy proposal that develops a new, framework within, a policy organization. We co-create a new social system, and that's not entirely emergent. It's co-created. And so the logics of framing, of idealization. So on the right, there are these systems principles. That is the big list that are from complex from systemic design principles for complex social systems article, and they're allocated against systemic design stages, which are out of the Design Journeys book, and then other design stages, which are just generic design. And so these principles then can apply as logics in each of these design stages, but they also are system logics. And they're also logics can help with making prototypes, strategic plans, policy proposals. And so they're different against these different units of analysis and design. We'll leave some time for questions, so I'll probably skip ahead here, but just And I can provide the slides later. So this is for each scale of system, there are different then units of analysis, we'd call them in research, but units of design. That in each unit of design, we are working with, like in an ecosystem, maybe the city is a place of identity, or an economic region, which is actually a different way to conceive of it, or landscapes, bioregions, conversations about bioregion economics yesterday. I mean, this is real. I mean, these are all different units of analysis and design. Within sociopolitical territories, the difference, there are many scales here, and each one's going to be different. And you wouldn't use the same design process for social systems, for processes and practices. So just show a couple pictures of these, and these, so if we use 3 horizons, for example, as a temporal, but also transformation logic model. We use this one with future seafood sustainability strategy, which is being used in a large seafood value constellation that involves NGOs, buyers, service providers, and fisheries, hundreds. And so this is not even so much a theory of change, but a way of getting to a common understanding of kind of the future conditions for finance, innovation, collaboration within a complex industry system, within complex disease contexts. This is a synthesis map for mapping out kind of inequities across Canadian regions, so between urban, which are gray, small town and rural, which are the green, and then northern remote, which are blue, and inequitable outcomes in cancer diagnosis, and how to kind of bridge those differences with changes of policy and where to intervene. That is a future design. That is a policy system that could be done. And then another one might be, this is a theory of system change in action. So a theory of change for social stock exchange, which is another kind of outcome-based logic model. So I'll just finish here. I mean, why this is important, because I think service design practice has developed clearly defined value proposition models for clients, customers, and markets. And systemic design has evolved from a theory, in academia quite a bit, to practice, like systems practice also did. But we're based in design, very much. And so the value in systemic design is less tangible to, let's say, untrained clients. So there are common problems that we have in proposing systemic design to complex organizations, where we have an unclear value return in the near term and the long term. And so there may be, indeed, systemic design may have lengthy and indeterminate value, but not at every level of a multi-sided value offer. That is, there's immediate value, there is real long-term value. We may just not be selling it well, and there are many different system logics. And if we misuse these logics in the wrong way, we may overshoot by, and this is very typical, promising radical change when we aren't there to do it, or to undershoot by selling an inappropriate kind of offer that really doesn't, that is inappropriate for the context, because we don't understand all the sufficient complexity in the system, or we didn't have the right stakeholders in the developmental process. So here's some questions I'd like to continue with, and I'd like to I can stay a little longer. I realize we're coming up close to the lecture time, but I'd like to entertain some questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Great presentation. And as you say, we are almost in the end of this seminar. But I think we pick 1 or 2 questions from the chat that has been coming in, and I start with one from Sanna, and the question is that she said, I like the 4 lenses, but with the meta crisis of the world, I'm missing the lens of future generation. Would you please say something about that?
Well, like I said, temporality wasn't going to be, so the 4 lenses, I'm assuming, in total system value. And so the temporality of a future system outcome is going to be based on the the governance context of your system stakeholders. So as I said, systems do not have decision makers. They can't necessarily, they can create the conditions for those outcomes, and they can have, and this is going to be a trade-off. And we can also include participants in as stakeholders that represent ecosystems, that represent, all of the different varieties of people, of organizations, and of ontological commitments. So different ontologies will have different temporal viewpoints. If you have not politicians, but let's say lawyers, scientists, and philosophers among your stakeholders that have different ontologies or can speak to those, they may have very different conceptions of how future value unfolds. So we don't want to be naive about like, well, whatever we design needs to be better for future generations, because we don't know how systems will unfold and change. They're also influenced in many different ways. We don't know yet really how to create that kind of social resilience, and we don't want to make a system so rigid that it becomes like authoritarian in the future either. But if it's too flexible, it can morph by different actors over time that will extract different value. We've seen that in like American democracy, for example. So I'm just saying they have to be, I think we have to have governance systems that will move along with them over time. So you're right that the system value proposition is created by the knowledge in the room, and it is not a temporal logic. But the other ones I was showing are do have temporality in them. So the three horizons, certainly where we work from a third horizon future vision, we often don't use a long enough future vision. Three horizons in this case was seafood. It was called Seafood 2030, the program, but we used generally an outcome of 2050. And I've worked with municipal climate change planning that tried to use 2045 in it and did in its climate planning engagements, but then the actual plan was, because of political considerations, this is in one case, was reduced to a 10-year plan, right? So you can go in with the best future logics. This one also has future implications, but this one in particular, when you use a theory of change, we've really tried to use systemic theory of change as a way to really also kind of extend into longer time frames. So time frame is really a whole nother conversation though too. So thanks.